Morning, everyone. Welcome to our event on towards 2040 and beyond, the role of carbon removals in the EU climate framework. I'm very happy to see many familiar but also new faces here today, and I'd also like to welcome the online participants. I guess we will have around 100 people also attending online. So for those who don't know me, I am Fabiola de Simone. I'm policy expert on carbon removals at Carbon Market Watch, and I also coordinated the cool down co-creation process on carbon removals. That will be very much the focus of today's event. Before getting into the objectives of the event, I would like to welcome our speakers. First, sitting at the table next to me, we have Fabien Ramos, who's struggling a little bit with the light on his face. I'm so sorry. Fabien is policy officer at the Land Economy and Carbon Removals Unit at the DG Clima of the European Commission. Next to him, we have Sabine Frank. She's executive director at Carbon Market Watch. We then have Martin Kames. He's a senior researcher at the Oeko-Institut, and also Felix Schenuit, who is research associate at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. There's actually also another speaker joining online. I'm asking maybe if we can put him on the screen. Is Oliver Geden, who is senior fellow and head of the research cluster on climate policy and politics at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, and is also vice chair of the IPCC working group 3. I hope we can manage to put the Zoom call on the screen with Oliver. Also, since he will be the first speaker, so it would be great to have him. So thank you very much for being here. So we gather here today to officially launch and present the results of our co-creation process on carbon removals, during which with a wide group of stakeholders we try to, and here we have Oliver. Good morning, Oliver, can you hear us? Thanks a lot for being here. So during this co-creation process, we focused on improving the way the EU is currently approaching carbon removals and trying to find concrete policy solutions for a better governance of carbon removals in the EU. The project was conceived by Carbon Market Watch to address what we think is a lack of clarity in the current climate framework about the role, but also the expectations for carbon removals in the EU. And the project was based on the principle that emissions reduction, land-based sequestration, biogenic sequestration, and carbon removals should be dealt separately in order to make sure that we slash our emissions, but at the same time we dedicate effort to protect our natural sink and at the same time also develop permanent carbon removals. So the project was based on the idea on the approach of co-creation and on fostering collaboration between experts from different backgrounds, from industry, academia, and NGOs, civil society. So today we will talk about this process and the results, but first we will have Oliver and Fabien, who will provide some introductory statements. Oliver will will share some insights on his recently published article he co-authored on calling countries to distinguish between removals and emissions in their climate pledges, and maybe also to update us a little bit on the IPCC work on removals. And Fabien instead will share with us some remarks on the process, our recommendations, and maybe also update on the state of the proposal for the 2040 target. And then we will get into the actual process and results. We have Sabine who will guide us through the objectives and the values of the co-creation process. And Martin and Felix instead will cover the two results that we achieved, which are a proposal for a revision of the EU climate law that Martin will present, and Felix instead will cover the governance of permanent removals in the EU, touching upon our second result, which is the policy recommendations on permanent removals. Okay, so I think we are ready to start. After the presentations, we will have time for a Q&A session and discussion. And yeah, I think we can start, and I would like to give the floor to Oliver. If we can put him again on the screen so that people in the room can also see him. Julien, our technician? Perfect. Okay, thank you. Oliver, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Sorry that I can't be in Brussels, but I'm stuck in Berlin in actually in a project meeting in one of the CDR projects we are running at SWP. And I will speak more on my IPCC capacity, because not to take away the attention for Felix, who's later gonna talk about more about EU climate policy. I was actually the one who coordinated carbon dioxide removal in the last IPCC report. I also negotiated the SPM section with governments, and that sentence that you have heard of probably 100 times, the deployment of carbon dioxide removal to counterbalance how to abate residual emissions is unavoidable if net zero CO2 or GHG emissions are to be achieved. That's something we came up with, and it's an entirely dull sentence, but I think it changed the debate, moving the CDR debate away from saying, well, global models show you need hundreds of gigatons for CDR to achieve 1.5, to say if you have a net zero target, then you implicitly already said yes to CDR, and you better now tell your citizens, your stakeholders, the world, what exactly you want to do there. And I think that was an opener into a conversation we're now having in the European Union, but also having worldwide, and hopefully at some point we'll also see reflected in the NDCs. So the IPCC does not tell countries how much exactly to do in terms of CDR. And of course, it depends on the gross emissions reductions they are planning for, but also the economic structure now and in the future in terms of residual emissions, whether they will be hard to abate or easier to abate. And of course, not in terms of what kinds of carbon dioxide removal they should actually approach. So governments, and we have that in the IPCC report as well, um, are tasked, if they have net zero targets, not to question whether they should need CDR or not. I mean, we're doing it already via forestry, but which CDR methods they want to see deployed by whom, when, at which volumes, and in which ways. And that's the point where we are in the European Union now. As you know, we have already that net LULUCF cap in the 2030 target, the introduction that within the 2030 target, we actually then account for LULUCF, something we haven't done before. And in the 2040 target, we will need to further define how exactly we want to deal with carbon dioxide removal, also beyond LULUCF. And as Fabiola just mentioned, we recently published an article in Environmental Research Letters. I can put it later, the link into the chat at least. It's open access, calling for this kind of transparency also in all NDCs, where it's not a strict requirement right now, and where we already see problems around the LULUCF contribution, which is often given just as a net number or not even as a number. So you actually don't know how much of that contribution would come from reduced deforestation, which is globally the more pressing problem, and enhanced afforestation. or reforestation. So this kind of splitting will enhance transparency. It will also allow to scrutinize how realistic pathways are, but also allow to openly discuss about priorities for mitigation measures in countries in the European Union, but also in and across sectors. Maybe some final words on what the IPCC will be doing in the future. There are actually two processes. One that has already been decided upon is a methodology report on carbon dioxide removal methods beyond LULUCF, and a little bit of refinement on the methods and the guidelines for reporting CCS value chains on national inventories. So beyond what we see in the voluntary market, beyond what the EU, for example, is now doing in and around the CRCF. There was already a scoping meeting, but governments still have to decide in a plenary in February 2025 which methods they want to see covered and how, and then the report writing will begin. And next week, actually, there's also the scoping meeting for the three big IPCC reports, Working Group 1, 2, 3. And of course, they will probably have more on carbon dioxide removal than the AR6 report, but the exact way in which this will be covered is still open. The experts invited to that scoping meeting in Kuala Lumpur will make suggestions, but in the end, and we should never forget that, the IPCC is an intergovernmental panel and the scientists are kind of providing a service to governments, and governments will decide what exactly they want to know on a very high level, not on how the assessment is then actually done. And this will also be decided at the IPCC plenary, the plenary consisting of governments in February 25. And I'm sure this will of course, influence the debate, but it of course also is dependent on the debate and on the practices in the European Union, in member states, and in other countries around the world. And it's good that we are taking this seriously now and find out what plausible and realistic contributions of CDR can be towards achieving net zero targets, but as stated in the European climate law, also towards net negative thereafter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for your contribution. I think this is extremely important also to set the scene to our discussion today and to show that the scientific world is also telling us that we need to work a little bit more to create, to govern better carbon removals, to build realistic plans and to distinguish their role. Unfortunately, Oliver will need to leave soon. So he won't be there for our Q&A discussion since he has another commitment in Berlin. But thanks again. I will now give the floor to Fabien, and I will invite you here if you wish. Yeah. He will. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabiola. Thank you very much for your invitation to be here today. I'm very happy to be part of this discussion on the policy framework that we need to develop together towards 2040 for carbon removals. When we develop this policy framework, I think we need to have in mind some, or try to stick some also key elements that are important in developing this framework. In your paper, you mentioned some of them. You're looking at the aspect of targets, governance, sustainability, to look at all solutions. All that is very important. I would like also to add some, maybe a principle that we need to keep in mind. The first one I want to talk about very briefly is, should I call it simplicity? To try to not be something too complex. I think carbon removal policies could easily be very complex when you think about it, just the scope of carbon removals. What do we mean by carbon removals? There are so many different carbon removal solutions. So we talk natural-based solutions, technological-based solutions. But then when you go into the details, some solutions are really, BECCS and DAC solutions are quite straightforward, and others a little bit more complex. You can also do, when you talk about natural-based solutions, the carbon removals from LULUCF sector, you have emissions, you have removals. When you talk about carbon management, some solutions are really carbon removals, others not. There is a permanence aspect, etc. So it can be very easily something complex, and we need to be cautious to not lose people when we start to discuss carbon removal. So that's why I think it's important to try, at least at the beginning, when we start to propose our policy framework, to keep something relatively simple. Anyway, it's going to be more complex with all the discussions and negotiations. So at a certain point, it will be complex. But from the beginning, I think we should try to stick to something as simple as possible and build where possible and where relevant on what is existing already in terms of policies. We have some policies that are working well, others that are, might need a little bit of adjustments. But we have something already in place in Europe, and we need to build on that. And I think it will be also important for the second element I would like to mention is we need to build something that people can accept on different, from different point of view. Of course, environmental integrity, of course, to make sure that we achieve our climate objectives, but also something that can be accepted by industries, that can be accepted from an economic, from a social point of view. We should really, we need to have both elements in mind that are extremely important and will be important when preparing the framework for 2040, but also when, of course, when negotiating it. If we put something too much idealistic, we might face in the current context some challenges to get it through all the political and the policy process. So something, I personally think from the beginning, not too complex, something that can be accepted by society and by different actors and different stakeholders at the level of the European Union. And we also need to think about the fact that maybe we should think a bit in a stepwise approach. And we have already done some of the first steps. We have, in terms of carbon removals, I'm sure that many of you in the room and online know that we are working on the certification of carbon removal to have this element of trust that allows us to focus on carbon removal solutions that we can trust, that we know that are really bringing an important climate benefit. I think the next step, it has been already mentioned, is to have a recognition of the role of carbon removal. So at the level of the IPCC, we have this recognition. At the level of the UNFCCC, somehow also. But in our climate policies today, we do not have yet the level of recognition of carbon removal that we need for the post-2030 and towards 2040. And I think it's very important that at the top of all our legislation, we recognize better the role of carbon removal, not only nature-based solutions, but also permanent carbon removal solutions. This is something that is important. And once we have this recognition, of course, we need to work together on the different possibilities and policies, to develop these carbon removal solutions that are today not ready yet. So there is also a timing issue, maybe not to do everything at the very first step, but to go step by step and to increase the trust, to increase the acceptability, the acceptance aspect, and to develop step by step the different policies that we need to support carbon removals. From an European Commission perspective, you know that in the next 2 years, we have quite a lot of work to do on that. There is a discussion on the climate law that is very important. I was talking about clarification. I think it will be good if we could have some kind of clarification on what do we recognize as carbon removal to achieve our net 90% emission reduction by 2040. And then there are the other steps that we need to look at. We are going to revise the ETS. We have a clause in details that is telling us that we need to provide something by 2026, an assessment on that. But we are not looking only at the ETS. We have also the legislation where carbon removal can play a role. So we are going to look at what will be the future of the effort sharing regulation, what will be the future of the LULUCF regulation, what do we need to do in terms of governance? Should we keep the current architecture, or should we try to merge some aspects and to have a slightly different architecture. So this, we will have to do it for 2026. The climate law, difficult to tell me exactly when it will come, but of course the proposal of the Commission will come earlier. Maybe some of you heard our commissioner saying a few words about that and potential timing. Today, it will be very difficult for me to confirm any date because I'm not sure that a date is really fixed at this stage. And you know that the new commission is just starting now. So I will ask you a little bit of patience for that, but I'm confident that it will come relatively soon. And then the last point I could mention is about the work on the CSCF, just a few words about that. We'll continue. So now we have presented recently our methodology on carbon removals for BEC, for DAX, for biochar, and we are working on other methodology. We'll continue the work in 2025. And this is, I think, a key element that we absolutely need for whatever policy we put in place by 2026 on the integration of carbon removals in our policies. The foundation should be the CSCF that brings the trust on the different carbon removal policies. And I think one last point I would like to mention, the financing of carbon removal. This is something that you looked at very closely in your work. And this is something we also are working on it at the level of the European Commission. So beside all the aspect of development of policies, we are also looking at how we could better support early stage development of carbon removals. We have a first workshop organized end of January. So those that are interested in this discussion could find more information online on the DG Clima website, and we'll continue the work on that towards the summer with more discussion around this important point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabien, for sharing with us these updates and also stating these important principles. I think that we can provide today and with our results already some examples of how the industry and so many stakeholders can work together and agree on something that is, I think, still kept quite simple. So on that, I think we simplified maybe your work, and you might be interested in using our results. And this is a perfect, how do you say that, direction. We can perfectly get to the second speaker, who's Sabine, who will guide us through the co-creation process and so explain how we conceived this process, how we got together, and what were our objectives and the values of actually co-drafting these proposals together with industry, NGOs, and academics. So I give the floor to Sabine.
Good morning. I can well imagine that you'd like to jump on some of the comments that Mr. Ramos has made, but I invite you to hold your fire until the Q&A. Today is the closing event of a year-long project, and it befits the occasion, of course, to present the results of this process. But there was also something special about the process itself, because it was conceived in the spirit of a co-creation. And in that sense, we think that the results are also imbued with a special legitimacy, and that is why I want to take some time to explain this process to you. We started with the observation that a comprehensive governance framework for carbon dioxide removals in the EU does not exist yet. Mr. Ramos has told us, of course, there has been a LULUCF regulation for some time, and in the last legislature, the Commission has put a carbon removal certification framework on the rails, but we maintain, as Mr. Ramos also acknowledged, this is not comprehensive yet. It's not comprehensive in the sense that the role of carbon removals in achieving the EU's climate targets is not yet set out in detail. It's not yet clear what kind of removals are to play what kind of role. And therefore, we set out to provide a policy blueprint to inform the policy making that must be impending, that we see as impending. And it's precisely because of this situation as well that we thought a co-creation process is called for and holds a chance of making a good contribution, because the topic is relatively new on the political agenda and policymakers do not yet all have their established position. So we thought if something good is delivered out of a good process by civil society, that it might fall onto fertile ground. The process brought together about 48 people who contributed either in their personal capacity or on behalf of an organization. The field of carbon removals is still small, so 48 might not sound a lot to you, but it nevertheless represents the majority of the most knowledgeable and engaged stakeholders in the field of carbon removals. And now, imagine it's Carbon Market Watch as a watchdog, an NGO with a watchdog identity that brought the people together for this process. And it included representatives from 4 relevant industry associations, including some of their members, 9 companies, key academics, and NGO representatives, including some of the most principled ones. And this is no mean feat to have achieved this kind of participation. And it might sound easy now just to reel this off, to tell you about it, but it took quite some thought. And what you see here is the beginning of the thinking about bringing these participants together. What we started off with was a so-called field resonance analysis, and that involved imagining carbon removals as an abstract spatial state with many elements in it that have multidimensional influences on each other. And what you see represented, you don't have to try and read what's in there, it's just to give you an impression. What you see on the post-its, there are either representations of individuals, of organizations, but also just of issues and of interests and phenomena in this field. And we try to organize them in 4 quadrants along 2 axes, depending on the kind of force that we thought and felt they were exerting in this field. So we grouped them according either to strong or weak influence, or positive or negative influence. And in the course of that process, it allowed us to identify the stakeholders we thought definitely needed to be in the process. And it also helped us to identify the topics that the process would have to cover. Another little glimpse in the preparation comes with this exhibit. Again, you don't have to try and read all the details of it, but what you see here is the starting idea that there are polarities in the field of carbon removal. So opposite positions that are not mutually exclusive, that are somehow in relation to each other. And one of the key polarities that we identified is that there are 2 poles here, one being the view, the conviction that emission reductions definitely have to have priority and CDR has to come very much later, referenced in one particular IPCC scenario. And on the other hand, those who hold more to the conviction that if we are to rely on carbon removals, then we also have to promote their development big time now, and we can't wait. Now, it's a bit crude this, okay, but it does nevertheless map the field. And then we went into details. I'll spare you more of our flip charts. We went more into the details of the benefits, the upsides of each of those poles, the limits and the downsides on the other hand, to see how upsides could be maximized, downsides could be minimized, and what brings the 2 together through what each side believes their greater purpose is, or the underlying fear of each side. Again, this is just a glimpse of how we began to structure this whole process of tackling this beast of carbon removals and beginning to engender a conversation about it. Here you see the entire timeline of the project. We took quite some time designing the project and getting trained up as a team to lead the project. Took us from November 23 to February 24. And then we finally set upon the actual co-creation process with 3 workshops. The first was online in February, then a second one was in person in March, and a third one in person in April. And after the second and after the third workshop, we had an editorial group working away with the results that were generated during the workshops. And finally, the results were ready and the endorsement process began, and that is also still ongoing. Now, in the next 3 slides, I will quickly take you through the 3 workshops just to give you a flavor of what was done there, what went on there, and what the quality of this of the process was like. I see many familiar faces here in the workshop who have actually participated, which is also a guarantee against me telling you any fibs about the process. I can't make any claims that are not substantiated because otherwise somebody will tell me. So here is the first workshop, which was online. Now, imagine working with 48 people on revising the climate law. Can you imagine it? I mean, we didn't think it was possible, but we managed it. At the bottom, you see the text of the actual climate law as it is set out for different small working groups that we formed within the workshops. And we populated the text of the climate law with the principles and concerns that should be taken up in the climate law, the principles about carbon removals and how they should be entered into policy. Started off with a collection of all the concerns, with sorting them, with homing in on the most important ones before we went into the small group work. And not only did we manage through the group work to place those concerns in the text, but the workshop also went as far as beginning to draft the amendments to the climate law. The idea of working on the climate law was to put ourselves actually in the shoes of policymakers, to work as closely as possible in the mode that policy makers would actually work, precisely because this work is impending, it's not been done yet, and we thought, well, let's do a sort of civil society trial run of what policymakers would actually do in order eventually to provide policymakers with a useful blueprint that they can take as an example. Here is the second workshop, and this is where we worked on the key components of a comprehensive CDR framework. We worked a bit internally with this metaphor of a pokeball. You will be familiar to it from your daily lunches, where you go to a place and you select an ingredient from each food group to make up a healthy meal. And so likewise, the concept with regard to carbon removals was that if we are to have to get to a serviceable strategy for permanent removals in the EU, then we would have to combine key components in a tasty way. So these components would have to be the targets and the governance, the financing solutions, the portfolio approach to carbon removal methods, and sustainability criteria, including an environmental and social dimensions. Participants had rotated in groups of 8 around the different topics, diving deeper and deeper into them, with each group building on the discussion of the previous one. And what you see here is kind of the crowning moment of the workshop, where all the results come together and they are presented and they are discussed. And this is what was then handed over to the editorial group. And the third workshop, this was when the participants looked together at the results produced during the first workshop, the revision of the climate law, and the results of the second workshop, the components of a carbon removal policy that had been taken further, had been elaborated by the editorial group. And they went again into groups to discuss and argue over the impact and importance that each choice of words may have on setting a clear and comprehensive carbon removals framework. And each group then defended their ideas in response to questions from the plenary to ensure that the formulations became coherent and consistent between groups. And what you see here is a crucial moment. It's not just people standing in random order in a room, as it might seem at first sight, but it's the actual positioning of the participants in relation to the results. The preliminary final positions were on the slides. You also see some Lego blocks which sort of delineated the territory that people stood in. And the question to them was whether people were willing to accept the results either as individuals, say if they were academics or could only speak in an individual capacity, or whether they were willing to take the results into their organizations and make the case for these results within their organizations. So people positioned initially, and different constellations emerged, and our moderator kept asking them questions, why are you positioning here, and what would make you move closer, what would still need to be taken into account, etc. To cut the story short, the result was that 80% of the participants agreed to either support the results in a personal capacity or to take them into their organizations. And you will wonder, what about the 20% who didn't? It was those who already knew that for very specific reasons, they couldn't go ahead in promoting the results because they already knew of a specific impediment in their organization. But that's not to say that they did not appreciate the process that they were involved in and took something away from it. Let me conclude by summarizing the essence of a co-creation process, just in case you want to do one in a different domain, or as a reminder to ourselves for the continuation. So what is special about a co-creation process is that it really sets out to achieve the widest possible participation of diverse stakeholders, precisely so as to benefit from a great variety of interests in the field and perspectives. And that's on the basis of setting just some very basic participation conditions. In our case, people had to agree to the basic tenet that removals, carbon sequestration in the land sector, and emissions reductions need to be handled separately to minimize mitigation deterrence and to reach climate neutrality in a safe and sustainable manner. Then co-creation is also special in that it doesn't just produce compromise between the positions of different stakeholders, but that it acts as a sort of incubator for innovative proposals which emerge from the collective intelligence of the participants. And we can say that really that both proposals that you will hear about in some more detail in a moment resulted from the co-creation process. They were an evolution of the original positions of the stakeholders. And the proposals would certainly not have come about without this collective effort. Fourth important point is the common positions in the end, they are not pinned down by any majority vote, but they result from systemic consensus making, which entails that whenever somebody has a resistance to a proposal that is made, that's precisely where you go deeper, where you investigate, where you question what is this resistance to the proposal about, and solutions are being found to that proposal. And the process goes on for as long as is needed until everybody finds the proposal acceptable. And lastly, this is perhaps sort of more psychological beauty of the process, is that the process doesn't generate winners and losers, but it generates the sense that the participants grew in their thinking, that they all learned something, that they enhanced their understanding through the creative exchange, and that they were strengthened in their resolve to contribute to good policy design through the experience of looking for solutions together. Happy to hear later on whether from the participants whether I've captured this adequately. This was perhaps a little bit exceptional, perhaps a little bit abstract as well, but I invite you to keep what you now know about the process in mind when you hear about the actual results that were generated, because as I said in the beginning, we are of the conviction that they give the result, that the process of co-creation gives the results a particular kind of legitimacy. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sabine. We keep the questions for the Q&A and the discussion session. We're a little bit behind schedule already. So no, it's not been too long. So I give the floor now to Martin, who will go through one of our proposals we were talking about, which is the proposal to revise the climate law to include more elements about removals in it. So Martin, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you, Fabiola, and yeah, good morning from my side as well. I'm happy to be here, and I also can support what Sabine just said. I really recognize the process as very, unique in my experience. Over 30 years of policy consultancy at the Oeko-Institut, I never had the same experience, and so I really enjoyed that, and I think also it supported the results of that process. And it triggered a number of discussions, raised a number of new questions and potential answers. And I think it was very insightful and constructive and forward-looking. So having said that, I'm happy to present now some of the main results of one of the products. And this is mainly the challenge. Basically, before I present the product, I still want to recap the challenge was to promote the development of carbon removals, but at the same time to prevent mitigation deterrence. So this is the kind of squaring the circle, which was the challenge there. And the tool to do this was designed to review the climate law in a way that carbon removals are reflected in a way that this squaring the circle could be addressed. And also another challenge was to ensure that the proposal qualifies as a revision rather than a recap of the climate law. So in order to be realistic and perhaps even simple, the changes should be limited to those absolutely required and not a fundamental recap of the climate law. And in that sense, I think you can see then in the result, the QR code is here given to download it. Many of the articles remain unchanged. Some of them have only minor additions or deletions. But then there are one article which has major changes and even has 2 additional paragraphs, exactly to incorporate the idea of carbon removals in the European climate policy. And before I go to the reasons why we included that, I want to guide you a little bit through the main changes. There are more changes, but these are, in my view, the most important ones. In Article 4, I think what you can see already is, or what is already existing there, is that there is the headline figure about what should be the net zero target by 2040. There's the discussion started already earlier this year. But it probably will be continued next year before the decision is taken. But what we developed in the process is that this headline target needs to be accompanied, needs to be or added by 3 other targets, actually 3 other targets. One is the gross reduction of greenhouse gas reduction, so not net reduction, but gross reduction, which should be also presented in relative terms, but also in absolute terms. And then in addition to that, absolute targets for both biogenic removals from nature-based approaches and permanent removals from industrial types of removals. And here you can see one part of the new Article 4a, which addresses the role of biogenic sequestration by natural sinks. And I think introducing a new para here and a new target is important, and I will come to that in a minute in a bit more detail, because their temporary nature. Biogenic sequestration by natural sinks shall not be used to counterbalance anthropogenic emissions. So therefore, they also need to be separated and clearly determined. Similar for permanent removals, they should be limited to the amount of residual emissions. Residual emissions considered as hard to abate emissions, for example, from cement, from from waste incineration, from agriculture, perhaps certain sectors of products of the chemical industry. All that is also mentioned in the proposal, needs to be determined in a process, in a political process. That's nothing which can only be determined by science, but it can be supported by science. But then it's basically a political decision to determine what is the target. And I think this is an important process which would be triggered by this article. So, but why is that necessary? And the first thing is the carbon removal that was mentioned a few times already. There's no such thing as carbon removals. There's a variety of carbon removals, and they all have different characteristics. And one of the main difference in the characteristic is the permanence or the durability of the carbon removals. And that is not a new thing. This is already reflected in the IPCC inventory guidelines, and thus also in the UNFCCC inventories. So we already distinguish managed land, which includes carbon farming, but also forestry. We distinguish their harvested wood products, which is mainly used in construction, but maybe other things as well, durable products. And then also geological storage. And there is another category in the guidelines, which is called just other. And that only reminds, I think Oliver mentioned that already, that there's a process ongoing under the IPCC to address the accounting of new methods or activities for carbon removals, including minerals and marine sediments, so biomass sinking or enhanced weathering, for example, just to mention that. I think this is also reflected to some extent or in the CRCF, Carbon Removal Certification Framework, because there are also 4 different types of units now, which also depend mainly on the durability and some other characteristic. So this is the first reason why we need to distinguish different targets. The second reason is transparency. Oliver mentioned that as well, and I think we need to distinguish from emission reduction from carbon removals, but at the same time address the different carbon pools and their different durability. So keep things separate, which are just not the same, which have separate characteristics and should be managed in a similar pool, in one pool each, in selective pools. So this would create, I think, enhanced understanding and also enhance the understanding on the effort achieved by policies within the EU, but later perhaps also elsewhere. And it would also allow to design and review policies according to the different methodologies which require different policies. So, and in the end, I think it could be also and should be also included in the nationally determined contributions, so to provide more clarity at the international level as well, not only at the EU. And last point, why we should distinguish between the different types of different targets is negative emissions. And here you can see a graph from the summary for policymakers of the 1.5 special report on 1.5 degrees by the IPCC. And it's clear, or I think it's called with high confidence, that we do need more CDR, more carbon removals, the later we start with emission reductions. And that report was published in 2018. This is 6 years from now. And a lot has happened. We had the pandemic, but we also had, I think, not enough drastic emission cuts. And so not the ones which are sketched on the left-hand side of the graph, but rather the ones on the, I think we are more on the track depicted by the figure on the right-hand side of the graph. And this illustrates 2 things. One is we need a a larger amount of carbon removals, but also that the biogenic removals have a smaller role in this situation. To some extent due to climate change, because biogenic removals turn to emissions perhaps, and then balance among themselves. Another reason to keep those things which belong together in a separate target, in a separate focus as well. But also that the amount of negative emissions from geological storage is much larger in the right-hand side. It is therefore, I think, essential to distinguish between permanent removals from biogenic removals and ensure that negative emissions are appropriately addressed. And then a short summary in my last slide. I think separating the different targets provides a number of benefits. One is that we have clear signals for investors, because this is, and I think perhaps as Fabien said, also in terms of clarity. So if you have separate targets for things which, in my view, shouldn't be mixed, then this provides also clarity and the clear incentives for investors, and they don't have a situation which is too complex and too much competition between things which are not actually comparable. I think this one would also then support the transition in the limited time frame which remains, so not to overshoot or not too much overshoot the budget which remains within the EU, and then at the same time prepare for negative emissions beyond 2050. So I think the separation of different targets provides an opportunity to square the cycle, to develop carbon removals and promote their development, which is needed, but at the same time prevent from mitigation deterrence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. There's always this awkward moment where I don't know whether we should make the applause or not. So sorry for not doing that. Consider doing that also for the other speakers. Okay, now we can maybe give the floor, and again the questions maybe later, to Felix, who will present the policy recommendations on EU instruments for permanent removals. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Just trying. What do I have to push to? Oh, okay. Good. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I can second that this process was really valuable. Maybe to add to what we've already heard, we also experienced the trade-offs that policymakers are in. When we were discussing the different wordings, we really understood what the problems are. So I think this really is a good exercise. What I'm going to do now is to present the recommendations that are in this document, and I really recommend taking one of those and reading them, because I think there is a lot in there already that we will have to focus on in the ongoing discussions in the processes that Fabien already mentioned. And here is a summary, and what I'm also going to do is looking ahead a little bit in key processes that I think will be relevant in the future. But first on the policy recommendations, and I will do just a quick summary of this. And we already heard about the first one, the target setting. This is of course key. The document really calls for legally binding targets, science-based and regularly reviewed, and at EU level and fairly allocated among member states. And I think this really is a key message from this process, that we should also talk about member states, because if we think about how climate policy is being done in the European Union, this is not something that can just be decided in Brussels by the European Commission, but member states have very different opinions about carbon dioxide removal already, and I think we need to take that into account when we talk about targets already, but also when we talk about the governance. So the document really highlights the effort sharing approach to carbon dioxide removal. So if we talk about ramping up carbon dioxide removal in different member states, we need to think about the different shares that member states maybe have in this. And of course, governance, we heard about the CRCF, robust MRV, and the role of inventories, the IPCC report. This is really key, and we need that for robust CDR policy. We already heard the importance of finance. It is important in terms of public money, but also private money. It is also not only the polluter pays principle, but we also have moments where we have to think about the ability to pay. This again raises the question of effort sharing maybe a little bit. So I think this is another important dimension. We also already heard about the portfolio approach. We have a wide range of permanent CDR methods, and these will also differ across member states. Again, I think we have to think about the varieties of CDR policy that we will see in the future. It's not a fixed portfolio for different actors there, but these can really differ. And lastly, sustainability criteria. We have some of them already addressed in the CRCF, of course. We also need to think about justice and ethical considerations when designing CDR policy. Do no harm principle, precautionary principles. These are things, and respect for planetary boundaries, that these are things that we have to take into account in all the processes that are upcoming, and there are a lot of them, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about now. Maybe some of you have seen this figure. It's from a paper led by Matthias Frieder, just an overview of what we currently have in EU climate policy. And when we think about CDR policy, in my view, it's not about adding something new fancy to this already very complex figure, but thinking about how to systematically integrate CDR into the 3 pillars that we already have. So we shouldn't just talk about new fancy instruments, but have the discussion about the ETS, but also not only about the ETS, of course. We need to talk about the effort sharing dimension of EU climate policy, and of course, the land use and land use change and forestry regulation as well. Key policy processes that are upcoming, it's the climate law, of course, we've already heard that, but it is also the NDC, where we will talk about the 2035 target. These processes are maybe linked in terms of timing, I don't know. Open questions, I think. We heard there's no clear position yet, and will be interesting to see. But I think when we talk about CDR policy, we definitely also need to talk about the NDCs. That's something that Oliver also raised at the beginning and in the paper they published. And then there is the Fit for, well, is it 90? I don't know, I think so, but Fit for 90 legislative package, that's then the next step when we design climate policy and CDR policy, the next phase of it. And it will, of course, be challenging. We have narrow majorities in the European Parliament. We have also difficult situation in the Council, maybe. It really depends on the topic when we think about carbon farming, when it's linked to agriculture, for example, but also when it comes to industrial policy. That's my last point here on this slide. We talk a lot about industrial policy and competitiveness now. What is the link between carbon dioxide removal and competitiveness or industrial policy? I think this really is an open question. There is no easy answer to this. We had this discussion in the context of the Net Zero Industry Act, and CDR didn't make it on the list of the strategic technologies. Will it be on this list in the future? I think this really is an open question and one of the key processes that we should look at when we think about what comes up next in CDR policy, and something really worth working on. And I want to close with one thing that Fabien mentioned. We shouldn't lose the people when we think about CDR policy. We shouldn't also lose the member states, and I think we shouldn't lose international partners when we do CDR policy. So it's very technical to think about how we do CDR policy in Europe, but at the same time, we already have to think about who are our partners when we do CDR policy. I've been working a little bit on the G7 as one forum. It didn't get easier with the election in the US, of course. So open questions whether the G7 as a forum can be the relevant one, but the partners that are gathered there, I think, are really key. And the principles for this are the same. So the recommendations that are in here, I think, are really a good starting point for the European Union to think about who's working with us on ambitious CDR policy. And with that, I'd like to thank you.
Thanks a lot, Felix. That was very nice and very well said. We have now time for the Q&A session and the discussion. Maybe I'll ask our technician, Julian, to turn off the projector to spare Fabien's side. And maybe we can also turn on the light a bit better. So for the participants online, please feel free also to ask questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom call. We will have a look at that. And yeah, I also encourage people here in the room. We have a microphone. Bastien is helping us. Yeah, to ask any questions, share impressions about both the process, the results, and maybe what was presented, yeah, by the speakers, also about the current policy process. So yeah, we already have questions for the live. Okay, so in case we can start with one maybe in the room, and then I will read out maybe for the participants online and also here. I mean, if you have a specific question for a specific speaker, don't hesitate to mention that. But yeah, please feel free.
Hello. Is it working? I don't. Okay, you can hear me? Good. Hello, André Prescher-Spridon from BUND, which is Friends of the Earth Germany. I have a question because I'm a bit surprised that no one actually mentioned the end of fossil fuels in this whole debate today, and also I wonder if it actually came out in the workshop. I'm asking this because if we don't end the use of fossil fuels, and our target is 2040 in our position papers, we overly rely on these technologies, which we honestly don't really know if they're working. Especially CCS has been proven to be very costly, quite inefficient. The same can be said about other technologies like direct air captures, etc. So I'm very surprised that this really hasn't come up today. And I'm wondering if this was part of the workshops as well.
Thank you very much for the question. I don't know if there is anyone in the panel who would like to address that. Sabine? Yeah, go.
Say at least something, and Martin is not on. It shows the green light, so it should be on. It's on.
Maybe go closer to the microphone.
Okay, I'll try again. No. The green light is on. I don't know what else to do. Okay, I'll just keep speaking until it comes on. Yeah. Martin will probably compliment me. I get the impression he wants to say something as well. But what I can, here it comes. Okay. When I talked about the process of who we included in the process and who we excluded from the process, we did have a cut-off point. There was a participation threshold, and that was set to exclude fossil fuel interests. So we did not have any participants from fossil fuel companies in the process that could sing the praise of CDR as a way to continue exploiting fossil fuels. I think that in a way settled the discussion or created the consensus amongst the remaining participants that indeed we have to head for an exit from fossil fuels. So it was, to answer your question precisely, I think it was an implicit understanding.
Yeah, and thank you for the question. I can add to that as well. I think I mentioned that the permanent removals should be limited to residual emissions, which are then characterized by hard-to-abate sectors or emissions from hard-to-abate technologies or whatever. And that would implicitly also mean that it's not fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are not hard to abate. We have technologies which are already cheap and can be abated. But those which are mentioned, like cement, that are process emissions, not fossil emissions. And of course, they can also be reduced through technologies where you use less cement or where you have cement with less emissions. But still, these are remaining. So I think we didn't have a clear phrase in the law in the proposal to exclude all fossil emissions, but implicitly it was kind of addressed, I would say.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions. I think also Miriam had one. I will just read one of the questions that we had online just to balance out. We had a question on the social dimension, and specifically for Fabien and Sabine about the CRCF process and the cool down process. Let's see, how do you think, how have you, do you think it's possible or now already or in the future to stimulate social acceptance of CDR methods by local communities, considering that most of negative effects of several CDR methods are shown on the local level? Yeah, if you have any insights on any thoughts on this. Also, of course, the other speakers, if they have any views.
Maybe since you mentioned the CRCF, I can say a few words in the context of the CRCF. So yes, this is an important element. For the CRCF itself, we also need to keep in mind that the scope of the CRCF is at EU level. Not that I'm saying that social acceptance is not an issue at the EU level. There is also an issue when it's about geological storage of CO2. Not everybody would like to have it in its own garden or courtyard. So it's an issue, and we need to have it in mind. But in the context of the CRCF, yeah, we have to look at it from a European perspective. We try to put some stringent requirement in terms of sustainability also, with looking at impact in terms of air pollution and these kind of things that are also an important element to look at when you talk about social acceptance of the carbon removal. And in my view, in the European context, when you talk about social acceptance, it's the key element, the essential element is in terms of trust. And this is really the objective of the CRCF, to bring a little bit more trust in these carbon removal solutions.
Thanks, Fabien. Sabine, maybe I see you want to.
I think we are at a stage where we, first of all, have a lot of explaining to do about what carbon removals are and what purpose they have to fulfill. So there is a big mission to pursue first in communicating the right facts and discussing policy or technical and policy solutions in a science-based way. I wonder, I would actually ask Fabien where this idea of a problem with social acceptability of CDR methods in particular comes from. Is it not wound up simply into wider concerns about climate policy and what actions need to happen and need to become acceptable to our populations? I would hope, I know the political climate is difficult, but I would hope that policymakers, rather than simply preempting negative reactions by making unambitious policies and being overly cautious about suggesting policy, whether they shouldn't rather still be in the mode of explaining, providing clarity on what is required with regard to carbon removals.
Thanks a lot. If there are no other takers, we had a few questions in the room. I think Miriam was first here, Bastien in the first row. If you can, and then, yeah, we have a lot of questions, so that's great.
So,
not working?
It's working. We can hear you.
Yeah? Okay. Okay, thank you. My name is Miriam Gutzke from I'm the climate attaché at the German PermRep. So thank you also for this, for the very interesting presentations, and maybe just one element on the previous question which came to my mind. I mean, it's not just about maybe that some people don't want to have this in their backyards. It's also about avoiding greenwashing, right? So we had a lot of discussions in Council to make sure that we have a robust framework, because that's really what we want, what we see. We saw a lot of risks in the Council that if we have a lot of releases, and so this can damage the public perception on removals a lot, and if we don't know who's reliable for this, and we are talking about quite long time horizons. That's also a very important element. And yeah, the talk of the town is the clean industrial deal, and Felix mentioned this. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on how to link carbon removals with the competitiveness agenda. And maybe also Fabien can give us some insights of how you see this and what's discussed in the Commission on this. Thank you.
Please go ahead. I don't know who wants to take it first.
First, Miriam, on your first point, yeah, I think when I mentioned trust, it's exactly this. And, it's very important to make sure that when we say something is permanent, it is permanent, there is a liability system, etc., all the link to the discussion with the CSCF, so I can only agree with the element that you brought. On the clean industrial deal, on this, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you because it's, even for myself, it's not that I don't want to say, but it's not yet 100% clear what is going to be in this industrial deal. What I would like to say is I see two different elements on terms of carbon removals and the link to competitiveness. First, we already mentioned it. I think it will be a little bit unfair to say that policies proposed and agreed at European level are not ambitious. I think climate policies in Europe are very ambitious. I think that the 90% that is on the table for 2040 is ambitious. Climate neutrality is ambitious. 55% reduction is ambitious. I think we have ambitious policies. And we need to continue on this way. But we also need to acknowledge the current context that we have in Europe, in different member states. Felix mentioned the role of member states. The member states have to be involved in the development of carbon removal policies. It's extremely important. And we need to provide for those sectors that have been already mentioned that are very hard to abate, some element of flexibilities on how to achieve the ambitious objectives that we have. So I see carbon removal potentially as a tool that provides this kind of flexibility with all the safeguards necessary, but a little bit of flexibility. And the other important element is when you look towards the future, today, I think now European Union is the fourth emitter in the world. It was the third for a long time, but now I think India took over the third place. We are at 6 or 7% of total emissions in Europe. We are going to achieve climate neutrality, but there is many other emissions that we are not sure at all that will reduce on time. And I think carbon removals will be needed at a very, very large scale in the future. And you can also see it as Europe developing a carbon removal framework, developing carbon removal technologies, are also a potential opportunity in terms of technological and industrial policies for Europe. We are talking about, there is a report from Boston Consulting Group that is mentioning about $1 trillion or euro, I don't remember, by 2050 for carbon removal. So there is also this element. Carbon removal, this is a service that we have to deliver to the society. But this is also an opportunity for some industries and technology.
Thanks a lot, Fabien. Maybe Felix.
Yeah, maybe 2 points on the industrial policy. Maybe first, I mean, the US really came out as a leader in CDR policy. We see a lot of innovative instruments there, also, by the way, including local groups. So I think their engagement work, that they're linked to direct air capture hubs, for example, really is something that we should look at. I think that's really a good way of including local groups. But the US, I mean, if you don't believe in climate change, you don't have to remove carbon from the atmosphere, right? So I think it's really an open question whether the US will continue with being the pioneer in CDR. So there could be an open spot for a leadership position in CDR policy. And I think the European Union is really well positioned in actually taking this spot and in thinking about how can we include CDR in our compliance regime. And I'm not talking about the ETS alone here. I think it really is the question, how do we design policies that eventually then also feed into the compliance regime? Because if we do it like the IRA, where we have huge subsidies on carbon dioxide removal, there is criticism out there that this is a bridge to nowhere. If you don't have a price on CO2, you would always rely on subsidies for carbon dioxide removal. And I think the European Union really is in a unique position to link it with carbon pricing and other climate policy instruments that that we have. It's a very complicated question of how to do that. That's all the technical stuff. But I think in terms of the underlying structure of where the EU is, to link these two things, this can really work out. The open question is, but this is relevant for all questions, where does the money come from? And what is the argument to say, well, we should put the money on CDR and not in other mitigation options? And I think this is really, I don't have an answer to this question. I think we have to really think about this hard in the next few months when we hear more about what the Commission is going to do, and also what the member states are going to do. I mean, we see processes in several member states, and I think we should also think about how to pool these initiatives in maybe groups of countries that already do CDR. Yeah.
Yes, please. Another question in the room, Ingrid?
It's less of a question and more of a comment. So very quickly. So Ingrid from Carbon Balance Initiative, and I just want to highlight as well, so I was part of the workshop, and to build off what you just said, Felix, a lot of what we discussed around the ability to pay as well was not only the effort sharing between member states, but also the sector ability to pay for CDR. And we talked specifically about oil and gas having a responsibility to build up this sector. And I guess I want to plant the seed here that this is also something the EU can lead on, is embed CDR in sector-specific compliance or regulatory structures. So if you want to focus in on certain industrial emissions or industrial sectors, that is one thing. You could also build further on the Article 23 in the Net Zero Industry Act, which currently puts an obligation on the oil and gas sector. And we did discuss that in the workshop, but yeah, so it's more of a comment.
Thanks a lot, Ingrid, for providing more insights about what we discussed during the workshops. And I'm just using this opportunity also to read out loud a question that we got online on how we finance carbon removals. And I don't know if there are any thoughts from the speakers here on what we can do to best finance carbon removals methods. Fabien?
Just one word and reacting to this and the comment. I understand that in the context of this project, you wanted to avoid to have messages that could be how I don't know how to say it, but it was delicate for you to look at fossil emitters because for the reasons you explained. But it's when discussing climate policies, when discussing carbon removal policies, it's also important to have them on the table because, and it's also linked to how to finance carbon removals in the future. You mentioned the NZR Act, and this is an obligation on the oil and gas industry to provide the injection capacity for CCS. And when we talk about permanent carbon removal and scaling up permanent carbon removal at the level of carbon removal that Europe will need for its own neutrality, but maybe even more that the world will need if we want to keep temperature at a reasonable level, it's going to be difficult to do it without CCS. And who has the technological knowledge for CCS? This is probably oil and gas industry are very relevant in this context. And if we want to put in the future some obligations, because once again, this carbon removals is a service to the society, and if we want to make it mandatory, Felix said it, someone will have to pay, and we have to find who is going to pay for that. And if we think that oil and gas industries will have to take part of the responsibility of paying for these carbon removals, we also need to have them in the discussion to see how we could put that together. And some people are also talking about aviation, for instance, that it could be another way of looking at how to finance the carbon removals. We need all the society really around the table for that.
Thanks a lot, Fabien. Maybe there are other Sabine and then Martin, or Martin first, as you wish.
I just counter there. It's a different matter to have fossil fuel extractive interests around the table when we're talking about governance solutions, to when we talk about coming up with the technological solutions and building on the skills of an industry that might be salvageable for the future, even though the extraction of fossil fuels itself is not. And so this is the concern that we kind of implemented by defining this threshold for participation, which excluded fossil fuel interests. I mean, of course, what is supposed to happen to the fossil fuel industry is a very, very big question. It's a field, it's a sector that wants to stay in business by all means, and of course holds on to CDR as a way of securing its own future, but is also needs to be looked at very critically, because on the one hand they provide themselves as the solution, portray themselves as a solution provider, and cover up at the same time that they're not ready to make the transition away from fossil fuels completely.
Yeah, just to add on that, I think the discussion on financing CDR is even more mature than on the technologies and methodologies itself. So we just start thinking about that, and I think some of the ideas which are around to include that into the ETS are probably a bit, that's at least my view, premature. For one reason also, because in the longer term, there's no fossil emission anymore, or hardly any fossil emission in the ETS. And then will you develop an industry on a finance source which is disappearing? So in the longer run, if you talk about negative emissions, who should pay for negative emissions? So there's no culprit you can identify, I think, or it's hard to identify. And so I assume that governments or a government agency or a federal budget somehow need to be involved in the longer term in that. And taking that into account, you should also consider how to finance right now the development of the technologies, considering what would be the longer term target of negative emissions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Martin. I don't know, Felix, do you want to intervene? Or
maybe just briefly, and supporting the last point you made. I mean, there are a lot of conceptual ideas out there how to finance CDR, and I agree that they are not mature, and it's early in the discussion. And personally, I think it's good that we have these conceptual debates now and don't rush into one of these solutions. I think there is a lot of more work to be done before we decide that. But there is a short-term thing that we can do, and that is to think about how to support CDR in the short term with some kind of procurement, for example. This is, of course, public money, and this doesn't solve the question, how do we finance CDR until net zero and maybe thereafter. But this is something that we will have to do anyway if we are serious about net zero. So I think that's because Fabien, I think you mentioned some kind of sequencing is important, and I think this first step is some kind of no regret step.
Absolutely, and we need to start to finance on a result-based approach CDR, because now in Europe we have Horizon Europe, we have also the Innovation Fund that has a few carbon removal projects. But I think we need also to think about something else. We need to think about an instrument that could maybe start small, but organize some purchasing of carbon removals certified by the CSCF, and to be sure that we have the quality of the removals behind, and see with what kind of fund we can start the financing of this. Probably some public money involved on that. I'm not sure we'll manage to get huge funds. I don't think we could get the amount of money that we got, for instance, for hydrogen and for others. But we need to start on that, and also to see how we can pool different sources of finance. And this is something that has been already said, and this is something very extremely important. We need to look at what the European budget could do, but we also need to look at what member states can do. Can we pull together money from member states in a common instrument? Like auction as service, for instance, for hydrogen. Does it make sense to have something like that on carbon for carbon removals? And private money. We have, and back to who can pay, who has the capacity also to pay. Some companies are willing to pay for carbon removals, and I think we need to encourage that and put in place a framework that could help.
Thanks a lot, and I think Sabine also had a comment.
I don't know how you intend to conclude, Fabiola, but at this point I could possibly say something about our intended continuation of the project, or do you want to cover that?
Go for it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, a one-year project, while it was a good project and we're proud of the results, we see, of course, the need for a continuation. We don't know whether it will happen, but we have the intention of making a continuation happen, and the question of the funding of CDR, of permanent removals in the future, is clearly key. At the moment, what we see is that instruments that we already have, funding possibilities that we already have, are being homed on despite significant problems being associated with them. I just give you the keywords of CDR integration into the ETS, or looking to the voluntary carbon market, and in the CRCF, the carbon removal certification framework. Thank you, Sam. Although it isn't explicit about the uses that are supposed to be made of the certificates, but it is reasonable to assume that some of them will be for sale in a voluntary carbon market. We need to go beyond these solutions. The policy making at the EU level needs to be injected with a bit more creativity there. We also need to dare to think of the introduction of potentially new instruments. I know it's difficult in politically conservative times to say it broadly, but somebody needs to dare to inject some new thinking into this field. And so we are looking to another co-creation process that will provide some new insights, some new inspiration about precisely this question of how to fund CDR.
Thank you, Sabine. Maybe we have time for one very last question. I don't know how to choose, but we will have a lunch later, and you can ask the question later. I don't know who have, yeah, maybe, okay, thanks. Yeah, sorry.
What a relief. On Dome of Seas at Risk. Thank you all for very interesting presentations and discussions. At Seas at Risk, we are quite worried about industrial methods of marine geoengineering, and we'll publish a position on that soon. The ocean also has an important natural function as a CO2 sink. So there are also nature-based solutions there to be looked at. I was wondering, in your co-creation process, whether you considered including the ocean on the one hand, and to the Commission the question, are there plans of looking into ocean-based methods under the umbrella of the CRCF? Thank you.
Is there anyone who wants to address this question more?
Maybe shortly from the CRCF perspective. So now we didn't look at any solutions from the ocean, but next year we are going to start to explore to try to understand if there is any ocean solution that we could look at. So not at all to commit on developing a specific methodology for specific ocean solutions, but already to understand what are the approaches that we really can put aside, but because too much uncertainty, too much risk for environment, etc. And what are those that maybe we could explore a bit further? For instance, we talk a lot about direct air capture, but there is a growing momentum for direct ocean capture. Does it make sense to look at direct ocean capture or not? This is not something that we want to put aside immediately. We want to look at the question. So we are going to have a step-by-step approach on this, and we start that process next year.
Thank you. Martin, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just to add on that, or to explain, in the process, we just didn't talk about individual methods or activities for carbon removal. So the focus was really on the headline figures, on separate targets, but not on individuals. So I think many of the participants had their views on the practical feasibility of methodologies, activities, but we didn't conclude on that.
Okay, thanks a lot. Maybe there is time for one. Maybe I wanted to give the floor to Elizabeth, who was involved a lot in the co-creation process, and she had a question or comment.
Great. Thank you so much for allowing me to have one last question. And I also just want to thank the Carbon Market Watch team for this project. It was a really great exercise, and it was great to work with other stakeholders on this really important topic. So I just want to thank you for doing that. My questions around targets, but actually I don't think any of the questions so far have actually come up on targets and what the Commission's plans are here, but we are seeing this growing appetite within even the institutions for separate targets for carbon removal. The Parliament just a few weeks ago adopted its resolution for COP, where they called on the Commission in its climate law to have separate targets for gross emissions reductions. They've called it technical removals, but I sort of interpret that as permanent removals. And in LULUCF, they've also called it to be reflected in DCs. And I also think it's a very rare topic where NGOs, industry and academia are pretty aligned on this. So I think this really shows that there is some level of consensus here that we do need targets and we should have it in the climate law. So I know, Fabien, we've spoken quite a lot about this, but I do want to hear again, like, what your plans are with the revision of the climate law and whether you're planning to introduce separate targets.
So there is no doubt that there will be discussion about separate targets. And there is no doubt that at a certain point we'll bring clarification on the role of different types of carbon removals. The question is about timing and when to do what. I'm sure you have in mind the climate law. In the climate law, as I said, I think what is important is to agree on the ambition, overall ambition of the climate law. And this is the first and main objective that people working at the European Commission have. And for this, I think it's important, as I also said today, is to try to keep the changes as simple and kind of minimalistic approach to avoid to open too much discussions in all directions that might delay any agreement on this climate law. So this is the issue. But we should not see the climate law separately. I think the climate law is the first step of a 2 or 3 years process that we'll have towards 2026, and where things will unfold and will bring clarification on that. Yeah, and the point you made on permanent removal is extremely important, in my view. To agree, do we want to make a distinction, nature-based solutions, permanent removal solution, or technological or industrial? Because it's not a always one-to-one. And why, if we have some technological solutions that are not fully permanent, but long-term, do we think they could bring a benefit to achieve our climate ambitions? Or do we think that we need to discard them because they will not be in the emission reduction part, they will not be on the permanent removal part? So where are we going to put them? And there are all these discussions that can very quickly become complex. I know that some member states have already, and I think Germany is one of them, looked at potentially putting, and I don't know the exact wording they are using, but permanent solution, let's say carbon or industrial technological carbon removal in their law. And when you look at how to define the scope and how to define the criteria to judge if we are going to achieve this target, can be very tricky. So the beauty of the climate law, in my view, is to keep it as simple as possible. And then after, all this complexity should come later in the other policies that will go just after the climate law.
Thank you very much. I think we are coming to the end of our event, and yeah, I'm sorry if we couldn't address other questions, but yeah, we have a limited time and it's a very interesting discussion and debate. So I would like to thank you very much for being here in the room, and also thank you the participants online, more than 120 participants who are I hope still with us online. I think we learned a few things today. We learned that we can work on concrete proposals to make sure that the EU remains serious about slashing emission, but at the same time also works on the activities that need to be developed in the land or biogenic sector, but also in the field of permanent removals. And we have proposed a few of these solutions, and I think we also learned that we can work together for a greater, better purpose, and we can still achieve some concrete results. And I really hope that our policymakers will ever look at our documents and maybe also use them in the upcoming process. And also I hope that we us can continue our work together and not work in silos, because I think we manage, if we work together, to achieve something that alone we wouldn't be able to do. So I think that's really important and valuable. So yes, thank you very much for being here. As Sabine mentioned, we hope there will be a continuation to this project. This is still not certain, but in the next phase, we would like to focus on the financing aspect, because also from today's discussion, we hear it's a very important aspect of the debate. So yeah, stay tuned. And for the people in the room, we have lunch provided. It will be in the restaurant area. So yeah, feel free to stay for lunch. And thanks a lot again, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you to the speakers.